Hey everyone, welcome back to the Kino Corner. This is a very special episode. Today I'm joined for a discussion and an interview with director Brett Morgen. I first discovered his work at Sundance a few years ago with a Kurt Cobain montage of Heck. And recently he put out another documentary about another uh, musical artist, David Bowie, called Moonage Daydream. I hope that all of you were able to see it in IMAX. I saw it here in Austin at the Bullock. It was this giant IMAX screen. It's the IMAX laser, so it's like whatever the newest one is. And it was like, I think my ears were ringing after. Just to start it off, hey Brett, thanks for joining.
Thank you.
What was it like the very first experience of watching Moonage Daydream on IMAX?
Well, if we're going to be candid, I was a little freaked out the first time I saw it in IMAX. I don't. I think the first time I saw it in IMAX was probably the least satisfying version. The first time I saw it was at the Playa headquarters, and I'm not a big fan of that particular room. Some of the IMAXs have very steep inclines, and the one in
Mm-hmm.
Playa is set up so that it's to one third scale, but most of the seats are like the bottom third seats, and it was just like I was like, man, it's too big. It's like why is it so big? Um, the first time I enjoyed the film in IMAX was in
Mm-hmm.
Cannes at they have a beautiful IMAX theater about 20 minutes um, outside the Palais. And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, that was kind of that was exciting. What I've learned essentially, which I had no idea of, because for years I've just been going to my local IMAX, thinking all IMAX theaters are the same, and I've seen Moonage Daydream in I think about probably 20 or 25 different IMAX theaters. And one thing I learned is there are no two IMAX theaters that are identical. The sound levels
No, they're
tend to
not.
be totally consistent, and the strength of the bulb is generally consistent. But how it gets rendered in that space changes dramatically. My favorite presentation, the one I kept going back to over and over again, was the Chinese Theater in LA, on Honolulu Boulevard, which is a 900 seat theater. And so the distance from the screen to the last row is like, it's enormous, you know,
Yeah.
and so it allows for the picture to be huge, but you don't have to be right on top of it. And the sound is such that if you can imagine how much sound has to be pumped from the front speakers to be able to penetrate the back of the room. So if you want to like a
Yeah.
full audio experience and you sit on the bottom of the near the screen, it's so yeah. But IMAX is like a manager at Lincoln Square said it to me best. He said, IMAX is kind of the preferred medium for scale of picture, but Dolby Atmos is probably preferable for audio presentation, which I would tend to agree with, partially because you're closer to the source of the speakers in most theaters in Atmos, um, versus there's no IMAX room you're going to be in where the ceilings aren't pretty high up.
Yeah, and talking about IMAX, there's a AMC IMAX here in Austin. Well, there's a few IMAX screens here in Austin, but I went to see one movie at one of the AMC's, and the IMAX screen was actually not much bigger than like a normal screen, and I was like, I just got gypped. Like, like this is I paid an extra $5, and it's basically a normal screen, and that's why I went and saw this at Bullock. Um, at the Bullock is in Austin. For anyone who watches movies in Austin, if you want to see something in IMAX, go to the Bullock, because the other ones are Limaxes. I think that's like the colloquial term.
I will
And
say this about the
uh,
the smaller
yeah.
screens.
Mm-hmm.
Century City in LA is kind of a small IMAX screen. Burbank's kind of a small IMAX screen. I personally think that that $5 is worth spending, because even if the screen's not as big, IMAX equates to quality, and they monitor the strength of
Yeah.
their bulb, and they monitor constantly are monitoring the audio levels. So those rooms are always super calibrated, same as the Dolby Atmos rooms, most of them.
Yeah.
And I had an experience.
Some of the other rooms aren't. Yeah.
I mean, I went when Moonage came out. I would go to every theater that I could get to check the sound levels and the picture quality. And as it happens, the worst was my local AMC. And it was like the last one I went to, and was like, could not believe how awful it looked and sounded. And what fucked with me was, I was like, man, I can identify how bad this is because it's my own movie and I know what it's supposed to be like. But I've been coming here for the last 13 years to see movies and having no idea, because unless it's yours, you wouldn't know. I mean, I go in and complain about the sound levels, but when Moonage played, they had the room was configured backwards so that the sound that was supposed to be going to the front of the room was in the surrounds. I mean, it was so twisted, and the bulb was totally fried, so there was no black and white. It was just blue and white, and it was this shit show.
But yeah, let's start. I actually wanted to ask maybe a little bit of a technical question. So you edited Moonage on a laptop. When
It's not a point of pride, just to be clear. It's not anything to boast. It's
no,
actually something I'm
horrible,
rather
actually.
embarrassed about. It's not. It's not. It's like trying to ride a unicycle down a cobblestone street when you've never been on a unicycle.
So how did you get involved with making a documentary on Bowie, and what was the process like of kind of getting this archival footage? Because it looked like you were dealing with a ton of archival footage. And was it like they gave you like film reels that you had to scan and you had to, or was everything already digitized? And like, what was the process like for that?
So the project began in 2015 in Austin. I was at South by Southwest at a screening of Montage of Heck at the Paramount Theater. And I was joined by David Frick, who at the time was the senior editor for Rolling Stone. Frick, who had done, I believe, the best interview I had heard with Kurt Cobain. David's a great writer. And anyway, we're at the show, and the way I mixed Montage and also Moonage and Crossfire is when the concert scenes come on, I crank, and probably louder than it would sound if you were actually at a show. I just like
Mm-hmm.
Get lost in it. And Frick came up to me after the show and was like, man, I've seen Nirvana play about 12 times, and that's as close as anyone's ever going to get to experiencing Nirvana. And bells and whistles went off, and I thought to myself, man, movie theaters have the greatest sound systems in the world. I just want to go in there and listen to music. Like, I want to go play Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in its entirety in an IMAX there, which actually happened. But I was like, so that's where it started. I was like, everyone's just listening to music on their earbuds and AirPods or whatever they are, and I'm no different. I listen to my new music on my iPhone, off the crap speed, mono speed, whatever, So I was like, and also when I was a kid, teenager, I used to go to Griffith Park a lot, to the Laserium, to Pink Floyd, to do the Pink Floyd Laserium show. So the idea of like going somewhere to immerse yourself for an hour in music and art was something that I was like, super excited about. I also feel that there are inherent limitations to biography in the context of a 2-hour documentary. I find it to be rather difficult to avoid producing anything other than a kind of cliff notes to history or a Wikipedia of someone's life.
Yeah.
If you're applying, a documentary script, Montage of Heck in script form is probably 22 pages of descriptions or, of dialogue, versus,
Mhm.
The definitive biography on Jane Goodall, which is 1,700 pages and like incredibly thorough. Like books are an incredible medium for going through the nuances and the minutia of a biography and cradle to the grave.
Yeah.
But that's not what I want from my cinema. That's not what I don't go to the cinema to learn facts. I go to the cinema to learn truths and to have experiences.
Cinema is more a kind of a expressionistic or like a impressionistic sort of picture of a person rather than like saying, well, this is because you don't want like a bullet point. Like if you're just going to do bullet point biography, you might as well just be making something for like a cable news show or something
Perhaps.
like
that. I don't want to judge, and I think cinema is for everyone, and it can be immersive and it can be factual. It's whatever you want it to be. I just feel that the medium itself, what it offers us in terms of audio and visual synchronization, I think what it offers us is a potential to arrive at truth, but in a holistic way. My end game with a film like Moonage Daydream is no different than, let's say, Alex Gibney's goal when he does a film from a more journalistic perspective. We're both trying to wrestle with the truth. We're trying to arrive at a truth. No different than fiction. I don't think documentary is any more honest or authentic or truthful than fiction. But a bad performance is a bad performance and, creates a moment of artifice that can bring the whole project down. Likewise, you can have documentaries. I've had the experience where I started off doing verite, where I remember our first film, On the Ropes. There were a couple scenes that people thought were staged, and I remember being, no, those scenes were staged. These other ones were, but those scenes weren't. And thinking like, wow, that's the kind of like, you can, even in documentary, you can have a scene that's actually was real. Everything in it's real, but it doesn't feel real. So anyway, this is all around long roundabout way of saying that I wanted to create a audiovisual experience, an immersive experience that didn't try to educate via facts, but via kind of an experience. I keep saying that word. So I created, as one could probably guess, because I don't have too much creativity, I decided to call it the IMAX music experience. And with nothing more than what you and I just shared. That's it. That was the full extent of where I was. Another colleague of mine was at that same South by Southwest screening, who worked for BMG in North America. And he was like, oh, you got to pitch this to my CEO. I said, pitch what? And he said, pitch the thing you were just talking about. I was like, what, the music thing? And he goes, yeah. I go, dude, I don't have any. I just like music and IMAX. He's like, no, come tell Harwood. So I went into this meeting with the CEO of BMG and sort of told him what I was interested in. And he's like, right now, this is 2015. He goes, right now, the greatest growth opportunities in music is YouTube. And it's also the greatest growth for visual content. So we've arrived at a point where we are now purchasing our audio and video material from the same source. And because, the way that I was pitching the IMAX music experience at this time was that, you could sit there and watch it and totally engage with it and have this sublime experience. Or down the road, if you're having a dinner party, you could just put on, this is, by the way, when they were going to be 40-minute films with no dialogue, right? I was like, you could just put on the Beatles IMAX music experience and it's in the background. If someone wants to watch the screen, they can watch it. And if they just want to listen to it and have a dinner party, they can do that. And so ultimately, I think what Hardwick understood was that he was getting the greatest hits of every band that was signing up for this concept. we went out. He agreed to finance 15 films with a set budget number. And I figured, okay, this is the rest of my career. And the plan was that we were going to do these for the science IMAX museums and take over their prime time scheduling. So there'd be like 7 o'clock the Beatles, 8 o'clock Zeppelin, 9 o'clock Jay-Z, 10 o'clock, Billie Eilish, whatever it is, and I was like, man, they're just sitting there. They're dark, great, let's take them over. So this sounded like I thought it was going to be fun. Yeah. So we're going out to bands.
Yeah.
Every band signs up because the premise was you don't have to do anything. You don't have to talk about anything. We're not going to go into groupies. We're not going into drugs. We're not going into divorces. We're not going into why you guys hate each other. I just that's not why would I want to go spend 40 minutes in a Pink Floyd IMAX theater listening to why they don't like each other. Like that's just not at all anything that's going to engage me. So the artists were all stoked because we're like, you're going to have your music presented on the greatest sound system known to on earth. And so everybody was signing up and we started going down a path with the Beatles and David Bowie passed. And I had met with Bowie. I had met with him in 2007 to discuss a different type of project. And his manager at the time became his executor, a man named Bill Zisplatt. And as soon as David passed, it just kind of was like, oh, so we got to do Bowie, and so I reached out. I called Bill a few weeks after David passed, and I told him what we were doing. And he said, this is quite interesting. And most people don't know this, but David saved everything. And for the past 20 years, he's been working with an archivist, kind of building out his archives. But he wasn't sure what he was going to do with all this stuff. The one thing he said is he didn't want to participate in a kind of traditional talking head documentary where other people would be defining him. Because David felt that in time, those stories become the history, and that's what it had, And so they're definitely, when I called him, it was like, I don't want to interview anyone. And now at the time, I didn't want any biographical component. So it was like, it's just gonna be music and art. But and that was it, man. I think Bill, whose background, he started as David's business manager. So he's not a creative and doesn't pretend to be a creative. I'm not saying he himself is not creative. I'm just saying he doesn't serve in that role with his clients. And I think that had a lot to do with the autonomy they provided. That I don't think David wanted him to be telling a filmmaker how to make a film. And so the one thing Bill said to me is he said, listen, David's not here to approve or authorize the film. So it's not going to be Bowie on Bowie. It's going to have to be Morgen on Bowie, and you need to embrace that challenge. So that's where it started. 40-minute, music experience for the local science theater. And then I went and visited the vault, the archives, and they were immense. I would say that they saved pretty much every film, anything that was shot on film for music videos from like 1983 on. They have every frame, which is unheard of. Like nobody saved the film.
Wow. Yeah, that's
the 16.
That's crazy.
Daily. It's crazy. It doesn't exist.
Yeah.
It's an absolute anomaly. They had everything. David, was for someone who traveled the world as extensively as he did in the 70s and 80s. It's just remarkable how well preserved his materials were, his journals, his diaries. I mean, so the covenant I had with the estate was that I had access to everything, and Final Cut, and we had to figure out how to get that material out to my office, in California. So we spent. This goes back to your question, was this stuff digitized?
Yeah.
Some stuff there were dubs of. A a lot of stuff we did a tremendous amount of 4K transfers. I mean, none of the music videos had associated video dailies. So we were doing, going back to Let's Dance, we were scanning, for probably over the course of 2 years. We scanned every document. We scanned every piece of media. We made dubs of every tape. We ended up with dubs of dubs of dubs of dubs. This was probably the biggest problem of the project, was that they didn't have, they might have 7 beta SP tapes that said Heart's Filthy Lesson, and no one knew which one was the master and which one wasn't. So we had to bring everything in and then sort out on our own which was the highest quality. And there were no shortcuts, because there were several instances where you would think it was a dub, but there would be a couple things that that were different, so then you just had to go through everything. So it was exhausting, having to get through it. And that really, because that's just not fun. It's just like, and we weren't budgeted for that. So we exhausted our entire budget, bringing all this media into our office. I saved money for sound and I saved money for color correct, but I blew through all other costs. So by the time I was ready to start editing, I had to edit myself. I had no money to pay someone. I wasn't
those 4K
as a director at that point anymore, because we had already, by the time we started editing, we were
because the money was up
past the point where we were supposed to have delivered the film. So the one thing my financiers did 2 things that were negligible. One was there was no contingency and no allowance for overages of any sort. So it was my responsibility to deliver a film, and it was my problem that there was a lot of media to bring in. The flip side is they forgot to put a delivery date in the contract. So if they weren't going to give me any more money, that's fine. I'm just going to take my sweet time. I mean, it wasn't fine, but I was like, well, I'm not on the clock. So, I mean, the film was supposed to be delivered in 2018, I think the end of 2018. And I think we arrived on VOD last night.
And of course, too, there was another setback while you were editing that. And didn't you have a heart attack and go into a coma during this process?
No, it was, it actually was before.
That was before.
Well, it was after I signed up to do Bowie, but before I was making the like going day to day. It was January 5th, 2017. I was shooting a pilot for Marvel, and I left. We were on 4th day of prep. I left the office, Prospector Studios in LA, and went to it's an Austin connection, and went to moderate a screening of the film Tower at the Silent Film Theater on Fairfax.
Was it?
And at 7:30, right when I walked in, I started having a heart attack. And Keith, the director, came up and introduced himself to me while I was having a heart attack. He's like, "Hi, Brett. I'm Keith. Thank you so much for doing this." I'm like, I can't really talk right now. And I'm making light of it. It was pretty intense.
I'm sure.
I ended up, fortunately, I was only 3 minutes from Cedars-Sinai, and the ambulance got there right away. I flatlined in the ER. I was in a coma for a week. And you would think an event like that would change you, but but the person who has a heart attack at 47, because they don't have proper balance in their life, doesn't just wake up a changed person. I woke up and said to this doctor, I was like, "Hey, once I found out what day it was a Saturday. I was like, I have to be on set on Monday. I am shooting a very important pilot for Marvel, and the doctor said, "Yeah, you're not going anywhere. I don't know what you're talking about." And 2 days later, I pulled the fucking plugs out and went to ABC to do auditions. So I was totally out of control. And it was about 3 months later, when the pilot was finished, that I sat down to start listening to Bowie. And up to that point, I knew his music. In the year 2016, I started reading books about Bowie.
Yeah.
Hadn't before that. But when I sat down and started listening to his interviews, that's where the film took on a whole different dimension. I mean, it became something completely different. And the idea of a 40-minute music thing was out the window. And because I realized that I had, this golden opportunity to work with the Bowie materials, and it was going to demand something different than what I had originally intended. What I did not know, what I eventually realized, was that David was kind of guiding me towards sort of showing me the way of how to lead a more fulfilling creative life and a more fulfilling familial life, personal life.
And that's what the movie's about, is about him kind of finding that balance in his life over the course of his career, because he, had especially in the 70s, he had a problem with cocaine and drugs, and I really like the part and how it's edited into the film, of like seeing all of his how he lived when he moved to West Berlin in the late 70s, and how different that change it was. You can hear it in the music. Like, I grew up listening to Low and to Heroes. You can hear that in the music, but it was interesting to actually see it. And I think that especially it's something that is prescient now with how people work. I do multiple, I kind of, like a lot of creative people, it's easy for us to overextend ourselves, working on so many projects at once, not having that kind of balance in life. And so, yeah. And I just want to say, I really liked how the movie didn't quite go the biographical route. It is it's kind of biographical, but it's more about the inner, the inner journey, rather than like a external Cliff Notes sort of journey that's mixed with like this, like it's a concert experience at the same time.
I mean, I think the film illuminates the artist's life, not necessarily what we would deem the personal life, which David never put on display, and very much kept to himself. And to the extent that it would not be possible to make a more biographical documentary with David narrating his own story, because David didn't discuss much about his personal life. Particularly until he met Amon, and even then it was kept very splintered. So, and by the way, I don't, in choosing to make a film on, if you're choosing to make a film on Jane Goodall, it's not because of her personal life.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah, or Kurt
that's another
Cobain.
film. There was a really interesting other movie. Jane had a really some very interesting beats in her personal narrative that just had nothing to do with why I was making the film Jane, and would have served some other film, would have been totally interesting, just not in the context of which I was. So anyway. So I think that it arrives, as we were saying earlier. I think that Moonage Daydream arrives at hopefully at a illuminates the creative and slightly spiritual journey of Bowie, So it's, yeah, it's,
I found that to be the better option, just because, like, I've read about the life of Bowie, and of course grew up listening to him and knew kind of all of the sort of external things about him. And it's sometimes it's fine to watch a documentary just to kind of taking you through like a rock star's history or something like that, but it wouldn't have made great use of IMAX. Like Talking Heads in an IMAX theater just isn't interesting.
I think that's true. I mean, and listen, I'm not by any means suggesting that I mean, I grew up on Behind the Music on VH1, which I think is like the gold standard for music docs. Like that's everything else is kind of deviates from there, if you will. There's plenty of room. There's not only is there plenty of room, I completely understand the appeal of the Bee Gees documentary. And I just, someone else can make those. I wanted to try something different. I think what's concerning, what's challenging, and what we need to, and you write about film, and so I would encourage you in this area, is that when you go see Smile, you don't say you saw a fiction film.
Yeah.
You say you saw a horror film. When you go see
exactly.
Black Panther, you don't say you're seeing a fiction film. I mean, you probably say you're seeing a Marvel film, but you can equally say I'm seeing an adventure film. In documentary, we have one word that's supposed to cover everything. And if my interests are impressionistic and your interests are journalistic, they should not have the same label, because we have to create a covenant with the viewer. And if you come to see Moonage Daydream with the idea that you're going to see what is the standard for music docs, you're going to be disappointed. You're going to wonder when the movie started. And then you're going to 2.5 hours in go, wait, what the fuck? I didn't learn anything about David Bowie. I mean, I did read a couple reviews along that way, to which oftentimes I'd be like, and I'm more interested in reading criticisms than sort of celebratory things, because I'm finding it fascinating.
Yeah.
But like, I found it I was like, aren't these writers embarrassed? Like that they didn't understand, like there is a narrative to the film, and it isn't just a YouTube, comp. And and by suggesting it is owning the fact that you kind of couldn't read the film in the most basic terms. But this covenant, this idea, even within the biographical sphere, because what I'm talking to you about is that Moonage Daydream is not a biographical narrative, but it is a narrative about an entity. And the other one, you can make another film where it's 100 people talking about David. It might be as truthful and authentic, maybe more so than Moonage Daydream. I'm not sure. It's just a different thing. But what's important is that the audience understands, the same way that when we, this is what we're dealing with in journalism for the last 50 years. I grew up with Walter Cronkite, where we trusted our news sources, and then we're now in a period where nobody really trusts the media anymore. And so, but that's not, you can't just have a blanket dismissal. There needs to be certain areas.
Exactly. Yeah. And with documentaries, it's like, you're not like, how are you going to compare, say, My Winnipeg to Don't Look Back to Going Clear to all of those have very different styles, like the Maisels brothers, just fly in the wall, direct cinema style is very, very different than something like Going Clear that's made use of talking heads, of interviewing people. And that's different than, say, a lot of Herzog stuff where, he's in the Nicaraguan jungles with the Contras, or he's, also including recreations of things in Vietnam. And it's like, that stuff is they're all very, very different from each other. It's apples and oranges, but they're all called documentary.
Very prominent documentarian, posted something on social around the time that Moonage came out and said, I'm so tired of people saying this isn't a documentary, it's an immersive experience. Documentaries can be immersive experiences. Documentaries are, cover everything. It's like the metaverse. It's like, and I was like, dude, that's really bad. I don't know what you're trying to suggest there, because actually we do need these categorizations, that you do need to know that you're going to an immersive documentary, which is something different than a historical documentary. They're different orientations. We should not be trying to throw them all under one umbrella. Yes, we can say they're all nonfiction, the way we could say there's fiction, but nobody has ever in the history of film criticism referred to a movie as fiction, unto itself. So anyway, this is not a tangential thought. This was something I had to live with every day that I was working on the film. This was the Achilles heel. The Achilles heel from the word go was, how do I create a covenant with the audience so that they understand that they're going to see that information is going to be presented to them in a manner to which they may not be accustomed. And perhaps like the super intellectual people like yourself who know film history or whatever can comprehend it. But, we're marketing the film all over the world to, there's a lot, like a lot of people don't go to documentaries, like there's a lot of people wrote, posted this was the first documentary they'd seen in theaters and shit. So how do you kind of, and this drove me fucking crazy. When I did the Kid Stays in the Picture, I had the same problem, because you're much younger than me. So I don't think you were probably,
I'm 28.
I don't think you were seeing the Kid Stays in the Picture in movie theaters when you were 6, but when that movie came out in 2002, there had not been this area that we're discussing was not a mainstream conversation. Documentaries were singular back then. They were there was a singular idea of what truth was. And so I kept thinking, as I was making the Kid Stays in the Picture, oh my God, this film is going to get destroyed by the press for something it is deliberately not. Like they're going to say, oh, this whole movie's bullshit. It's just one guy talking. And my feeling was, no, one guy talking actually is a more effective way of illuminating the truth. And so I opened the film. So I put a card at the beginning of the film for one reason. I was speaking to Elvis Mitchell at the New York Times. That's it. It was just speaking to the critics who are going to be writing about the film, so they couldn't say what they otherwise would have said. Because if you see, there are 3 sides to every story: your side, my side, and the truth. No one is lying. Memories shared serve each differently. It makes it a little harder to attack the film for being subjective. And similarly in Moonage Daydream, I was like, how do you get them orientated for the fact that, like, this is the movie? It's not like, when's the movie going to start? What? It is the movie. The movie isn't David Bowie on the screen. It's just as much the movie when we're going through space. It's like, this is what it's going to be about. So with Moonage at the very end, probably after picture lock, I inserted the quote card at the beginning about Nietzsche and about God and in part because, it framed the movie, but it also was a kind of keeping with the covenant that if your first piece of information is about a search for meaning in life, and this is God is dead quote, you're probably not going to should not expect to hear about the first time I heard my song on the radio. And when David's opening speech is about transience, this deeply philosophical musings about like life, like you're probably not going to hear about Tony DeFries. It's like, it's just not going to be that movie. And so everything in that first 20 minutes throughout the whole Ziggy section, if I'm cutting forward in time, um, which I do during Free Cloud, is very deliberate. It's very much knowing that I'm minute 6 into the film. I'm very early and I want to be able to go anywhere in the timeline. So I'm going to start with Space Boy instead of Space Oddity, because I'm going to tell you right up at the beginning, we're not going chronologically. And even though the film does tend to unfold chronologically for the most part, I created a platform or canvas where I could deviate from it where I wanted to.
Also in the film, I wanted to point out the space segments that I thought those were really cool. Actually, my favorite movie, I think, of all time is The Tree of Life. And that, of course, has that 30 minute long space cosmos sequence in that. That's another Austin movie, too. And
I got off so
easy.
I got off so easy on Moonage that more people have not taken me to town for poaching Tree of Life. But go on.
Was that actively a thought? It just reminded me of the like the cosmos section of Tree of Life in the space going through the nebulas and seeing it on IMAX too. I'm making the distinction because I like that. I'm not trying to say you were poaching it.
Oh, I was. What I'm telling you is I was very deliberately poaching Tree of Life to the point that when I showed the film to Sean Penn, I was like fucking embarrassed. Like I was waiting for him to say like, dude, you totally poached our effects. No, I that was a huge influence, both in terms of the thematics, but very much over the visual effects. I mean, it's like,
how did you do similar? I don't know if you saw the behind the scenes how they did the visual effects for Tree of Life. Douglas Trumbull, I think, did them, and they were used like they had like phantom cameras, so that were doing super slow motion. And actually, a lot of the stuff like the nebulas, it was paints. They were they had different kind of paints that they were in oils, so it was all like actually not. Most of it wasn't computer generated. They were like dropping paints. And how did you do the
ours were done in After Effects,
space
frame
stuff
by frame. It was all done in After Effects by Stefan Nadelman, frame by frame. No programs, no, like it was as handmade as one can possibly get. Those orbs during
that must have taken a long time.
He was stressing. He was only supposed to be on the project for like 6 weeks and was on for a year. And we really were, we hit a lot of walls creatively where we were just like, what do we do here? Like, it was really, it's kind of, so there weren't a lot of people worked on the film. I could pretty much count them on, this many people. Up until I locked picture, it was, when I don't mean to be disrespectful to the assistant editors. There were assistant editors on board. But in essence, creatively, there's one person up until picture lock. And then at that point, the sound team came on board. And then Stefan Nadelman came on board to do visual effects. And then lastly, we were joined by Tyler Roth, our colorist. And so these were my collaborators. And I would say that all of us experienced the same thing working on this film, which is we all had to go so far out of our comfort zone. It was required from every department head to make this film because we're trying to make a film that was taking its cues from David, which meant that we were not trying to be virtuosos. We needed to put ourselves in environments and situations that were challenging. And with Stefan, I gave him a challenge the day that he started work. We've been working together for 18 years. We did Montage of Heck together right after, and he moved down to LA for that, and we spent several months developing the journal, the style for the journals, which ultimately we, in our minds, we created a style that looked like Kurt was shooting his journals on Super 8 film. That was the idea. That was the kind of aesthetic we were going for. And then right after I did a film, The Zen Diaries of Gary Shandling, and he used all this stuff that we had been designing, and then he kept using it for other filmmakers would call him and be like, oh, I want that journal stuff. And so he came onto this one. I go, bro, you're not bringing, you leave your toolkit at home. This film, you cannot rely, we're not doing any stereoscopic photographs, none of that shit. You leave all that stuff behind. We're going to figure out what, and it's not going to be like one style fits everything. We're going to have to just kind of figure it out as we go along. So we started in Ziggy, and I had offline that and was like, okay, the photographs, he was like, what do you want me to do with them? I'm like, static, just keep them, I don't want you to fucking touch them, man. Just, clean them up, clean them up and leave them as they are. I'm not going to do anything to them. And he sends it back to me. I'm like, wait, what am I? I was like, I need color. I need it Ziggy. It needs to be, these photographs, because the Pennebaker material is so monochromatic in terms of its palette, that we actually need to, the film requires us to add more color. And the only way I could do that in this point is through the photographs. So that became the goal there. As we got into Berlin, it was like, what does the sound of Low look like? And that was really difficult until I suddenly was like, looked at Stan Brakhage and was like, oh, that's what Low looks like. I looked at Stella, and it was like, oh, this is, and I showed it to Stefan, and then Stefan just had to figure out how to do emulsion scratching in After Effects, which is not, there's no program for it. There's the scratching, but there's the film dirt software thing, which I hope, but the fact I'm making fun of it, no one ever uses it.
Like I'm a little bit of a film purist, and I have tested out some of these overlays, like these film scratch overlays, because people have told me, oh, if you shoot digital, you can just put an overlay and it looks just like film. So I've tested out even what people say are the best, and it doesn't come close.
Let me help you out. What you're supposed to do is add a film grain emulsion to your video work to give it a more film-like look setting. So if I have a video source, I'll pick the film stock grain. If you want to fine grain, use a 35, 50 ASA, but you use the grain to create the film look, not the scratchy thing, which is so.
Yeah, not the scratchies. Even when you use the grain to get the film look, film picks up light differently than digital picks up. Digital's a little bit harsher. Film has I think it picks up highlights a lot better. And so even then, I can still look at something and know that it was that it's a grain overlay. It still doesn't look quite the same. But I really don't like when people do the scratch it's as if they were using the worst Super 8 camera in existence, that everything is scratched to all hell, and I'm like, that's not really how that's any good film actually looks, and it still looks super digital because they didn't put the grain under it.
Yeah. No, Stefan's work, every shot that Stefan delivered, because I don't let him put grain on from where he is, because I want control over it. So when he delivered files to me, they all require, every single one requires a grain. And usually with Stefan's stuff, I was doing 16 grain, just because most of the stuff it was being intercut with was from that space.
Yeah. So you kind of did it like almost old silent movie style of coloring the black and white.
The color correct on this film was a lot like rotoscope, and was very similar to, at one point my colorist was like, this should not have been done in a color room. This should have been all visual effects. And what he was referring to was, we were probably every single shot has about 12 power windows. And, there are a lot of shots that are 3 frames, 4 frames. And I would say up until the very, very end, we were treating those as if they were like 30-second shots, which is kind of stupid. Towards the end, I was just like, hey man, the eye is only going to see this limited amount here. Let's drop the power windows. But we were the, we were writing the movie in the color correct. We were painting the film. We were painting the film to
Yeah.
arrive at ideas that weren't there until we colored it. Um,
Yeah.
Not to mention the fact that pacing to me is so regulated by color that when I'm trying to evaluate an offline before I hit the color correct, I have to, if I feel the film's 5 minutes too long, then I'm like, okay, then it's right.
Mhm.
Because I know it's going to drag until I get the color, and the color is going to like give this energy at these different points. So it's something I've learned to try to regulate. I mean, I acknowledge Moonage is long film anyway. It's, in fact, when we did a test screening, there was a question that said that the distributor put on that said, "Is the film too short, just right, or too long?" And I was like, before we went to thing, I was like, guys, you don't need to put this question. I made the film. It's a long film. I like purposely made a long film. Like it was not. I wasn't going to make a
Yeah.
short David Bowie film. It was not meant to be an appetizer. It's meant to be a meal.
Speaking of it being long, I know that you cut out you said a 12-minute station to station ending. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, so you had a 12-minute station to station ending. Was there anything else that you cut out, and like was it really difficult to cut out that ending, or were you just like, hey, it's too long, it's better to have this other ending?
I'm annoyed I didn't come up with the idea myself. And because I've long believed that you have to almost like getting a tattoo to prove your commitment to your work, you have to eliminate your favorite scene. Just kind of
Yeah.
like, even as a show to the editor who looks at you and goes, "Wait, what are you talking about?" And you're like, nothing is sacred. Nothing is sacred. So
Yeah.
I have, I think throughout my career, gone into projects with this idea that I'm going like, what's my favorite scene, and remove it, and then see if you can build it from there. Without it, Station to Station was my favorite. It was the first scene I cut for the film, and it was my favorite scene that I cut for the film. So I should have known that it needed to go. Um, uh, but it was, yeah, it was. I actually finished the film like finished like DCP, and was had my first screening of the film was with Sean Penn was there, and it was actually off his suggestion that I cut it, and I also hadn't had a lot of input while I was making the film from people, so maybe someone else would have brought
Mhm.
that up, but it resonated. I was like, didn't even hesitate. The only thing was, it was really hard I was like, how am I going to evaluate it? Because I have to watch the whole film through to see how it plays,
Yeah.
if that works. There was like no quick way to kind of test it. I just kind of had to blindly do it. And
Yeah.
yeah, and then the first time I saw the film with an audience afterwards, I was like, I cannot believe I had an extra 12 minutes on there.
Yeah, it's funny, and I mean, I think it ends when it needs to end, and it might have been too long with that extra 12 minutes on there. And even though Station to Station's my favorite Bowie song,
It's
you know.
it's I will say this, having viewed all of David's performances, it's, I believe, his best filmed moment. It was
Yeah,
incredible. That's why I
I've
landed.
seen
That's why I
that.
landed there. It's like it's you just, because I love the idea that that we saved the best for last. It was like right when you think it's done.
Is this the same? Yeah, is this the same performance? Because I've watched a few performances, or like on YouTube, David Bowie performing Station to Station. Is this the one where it's like I think it's in black and white, and it just starts off with one guy on the stage, and he doesn't actually come on stage until.
You've never seen it.
No, I've never seen this one.
No.
Oh, okay. Oh man, nah. I'm a little sad. Station to Station, yeah, that has to be my favorite. What's your personal favorite like Bowie record?
At the moment, probably Heathens.
Oh, okay.
54. So his later work speaks to me more now than his earlier work,
Yeah.
because he's writing about things that are more resonant in my life at this moment.
I also wanted to touch on another point in the movie. In the movie is that you said that all the different media that you have that's not like from the Bowie archives, Bowie referenced in some way as some sort of inspiration.
Except
And
Event
I
Horizon.
noticed like a except Event Horizon. Okay. But I noticed like a lot of films, you know, like Metropolis, like all these, like especially like older silent movies. I think Nosferatu. It's been a couple months since, because I saw it like the very first day it opened in IMAX screens. But I noticed a lot of movies, and in the sort of bibliography section of the credits, where it's like listing off all the media, it just kind of kept going on and on and on. Did you discover like any films that you hadn't seen that you now really like through
A lot
that
of
process?
Yeah, it's funny. It's funny, like yes, like I mean there are a lot of Bowie, so there are definitely some films that some classics that had, I don't know how I hadn't seen them, but I got an opportunity to see them for this film. But I gotta ask you a question because I know you're quite
Yeah.
knowledgeable on film,
Hmm.
cinephile. Um, did you pick up, do you know where the first shot, archival shot in the film is from of the lunar surface?
Of the lunar surface, was that from For All Mankind?
No. But I'm gonna
No.
give you a hint because I have a feeling you're a Kubrick fan.
Oh, it's 2001,
No,
right?
no,
Or no?
no. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to.
No, it's been a couple months. I don't have a
It's
frame of
okay.
reference.
It's the moon, the solar, the kind of eclipse shot that I run several times throughout the film, and the stuff with lunar surface.
Yeah.
That was from a movie produced
Oh
by
yeah.
the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation in 1961 called Universe.
I haven't seen that.
It was cited by
Is it good?
Stanley Kubrick. Well, it was cited as by Kubrick as one of his main influences for the visual effects for 2001.
Oh, okay. I'll
So how
definitely have to
meta
check that
is
out.
that? It's a reference to a reference.
To me, it felt like referencing 2001, but I guess it's referencing the thing that 2001 was referencing. Yeah. Oh, that's fun.
You know, I think all of that stuff was that was really one of the ideas I had before I started editing was I knew that there was going to be a limited amount of footage of David not performing. He
Hmm.
didn't participate until later in his life, what we would describe as documentaries. I mean, he did two, Cracked Actor and something called Ricochet, and that's it. And that's it for the first 20 years of his career. And there are outtakes for those for the most part. So there's no footage, observational footage of David Bowie. So I just knew going into it that I mean there are going to be limitations, and I need some other visual material to mine, and came up with this idea that I would two things. One, that I would create a kind of level playing field between his own work and the work that inspired and influenced him.
Hmm.
Um, because like Dylan, David is just constantly dropping literary references throughout his work. And sometimes you know what he's talking about, and sometimes you don't. Sometimes you know the reference, and sometimes you don't. And it doesn't matter because ultimately, if you don't know the reference, you ascribe your own meaning. You create your own interpretation. You don't
Yeah.
need to know when he says Bardo what he's actually referring to. It may be the sound that elicits something or whatever. So the thought was that, like, hey, you might know some of these references. You're not supposed to. It's not designed so that you're supposed to be able to add up what all these references are and have some deeper understanding than the person who doesn't get those references. If you
Yeah.
do know the references, then you have an enhanced, but it works the same way with I think if you know David's, biography, then you could fill in the blanks more as you're watching the film.
Mhm.
And the other thing that was done in advance was this notion that every image of David was performative. So obviously, when he's on stage, when he's doing an interview, when he's in a documentary, he's performing, and when he's in a movie as an actor, he's performing. And that doesn't mean it's not authentic or
Mhm.
it's not real. They're all expressions of a moment in time. So I decided going in that I would take his films that he starred in, like Manifold Earth and The Hunger, and I would treat them as ethnographic film. That there was a cinematographer capturing a moment in time.
And The Man Who Fell to Earth is really interesting too, because it was a film by, like, it's made by Nicholas Roeg, but it was playing into, even though I believe it was based off of a book, but it was playing into Bowie's persona at that time, and he used images from The Man Who Fell to Earth for his Station to Station EP and for Low. And so it was playing into his persona, and also kind of playing into himself. And it was a kind of a, I mean, one of the reasons I really like that film is that if you know the kind of context behind it, it makes it even more interesting. And it does feel like Bowie is expressing himself through that fictional character in the movie, more so than you would get maybe even with a traditional sort of documentary about him.
No, I would.
Bowie was like that with his characters.
I would
Yeah.
say that Manifold Earth is the best documentary made on Bowie, and that, yes, you're right, that he wouldn't articulate publicly why he was selecting a role, but if you know Bowie's trajectory, and particularly the way that when I was screening through other media, I would watch the films in the context to, within the timeline, and you start to really identify why he would be drawn to a role like Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence.
Yeah.
Even his cheesiest movie, Mr. Rice's Secret, which is like an ABC after school special, about a 12-year-old boy who dies of cancer. I mean, it's so syrupy. But the dialogue at the end of the film is from that. And anyone else who doesn't know that film would be absolutely 100% convinced that this is David in an interview. The thing where he's talking about, the audio that we use for the trailer, which comes at the Cosmos at the end, that's all from Mr. Rice's Secret. And then I called Nick Pegg, who's like the world's Bowie authority, and I said, "Can I show you this trailer, man? Because I'm a little concerned." And he goes, "Why?" And I go, "Well, the audio with the trailer house decided to use is from Mr. Rice's Secret. They obviously don't know that it's not something that Bowie said himself." And then I played it for Nick, and he called me back. He goes, "The thing is, Bowie ended up rewriting most of his dialogue for that film, because and he took the film because the character kind of reminded him of his father." And again, it was like, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense. That's why I used it to begin with, because it sounded exactly like something he would have said. And
even going into the, looking at his trajectory and why he took these films, right before this interview, discussion, podcast, whatever you want to call it, I was actually rewatching Labyrinth, which, I grew up watching Labyrinth, and that was like the David Bowie that I knew as a kid. And Labyrinth came out in, I want to say, was it 84, 85?
87.
Oh, 87. Okay, yeah, because it was right after Phenomena, because I was also watching that with Jennifer Connelly. But that was during his like pop sort of optimism phase. very different than Thin White Duke era or Berlin era. And when I was rewatching it today, I realized just how much fun he was having with the role, because I always, as a kid, saw him as like this antagonist, as being kind of creepy, and he is kind of creepy in the film, but he's having so much fun, and when he's like doing his songs and everything, I'm like, oh yeah, he chose this to basically have a lot of fun. I mean, that's what I took away from it.
I think a lot of his dialogue in the film, if you, I remember writing down almost every line he said felt like something that would be applicable somewhere in the film, because there's a lot of stuff about time. There's there's just a lot of kind of Bowie-isms in his in his dialogue and in the kind of thematics of the film. So much of that in Moonage Daydream, there's a sequence towards the end where David's riding these escalators, and every time I see it, I'm like, oh, it's Labyrinth.
Yeah, his it's really interesting to view his trajectory, visually through his movies, because he's like one actor, and I'm still currently working on the video for this. This can be a big part of it, is that he's like this one actor who he expresses himself through these almost like simulations of himself throughout his life, or these characters or these films. And I think that's an interesting way to that he went about not just making art, like say, like a lot of artists, a lot of musicians, they'll say, okay, well, the music is my art, the music is my art, and then that's it. Whereas Bowie was like, no, David Bowie is the central art piece here. That is an expression, but it's also just a little bit divorced from his personal self. So everything that he did, I feel like it all kind of coalesces together, which I think makes him one of the most interesting of the 20th century, late 20th century artists, just in general.
I respectfully disagree a little bit with that, but that's...
Oh, and no, how so? Obviously, you probably know more about him than me.
No, I don't. But that's the thing, is I'm not a Bowie expert any more than you are. I mean, the idea that someone could be a Bowie expert is insane. My ideas on Bowie are no more grounded. You may be thinking that I know more because I've read more books, but what the fuck? I didn't spend more time. I spent a little time with him, but so this is just this whole thing with Bowie, which is like, again, I meant respectfully, like I have a different interpretation. It's yours may be more accurate. I don't know. I'm not agreeing with you. I'm just saying that.
I mean, I don't think Bowie. I didn't know the guy.
I don't think. I'm just objecting to this idea that he was creating art through the filter of a character. I think that I don't.
I don't.
I find the character. No. I don't think he had.
No, I didn't mean.
I think he was. I
don't mean it that way. I meant it more like he turned performance itself, like it wasn't like he created like almost like an envelope for his music of the where his public performances, even his like interviews, right, were playing all into this like central art piece. Like Ziggy Stardust had, it wasn't just the music, it was like so many other aspects to it.
I'm not there with you on that.
Oh, you don't agree?
No, I think he answered almost every question he was ever asked as like honestly and direct as he could. I think it was totally the opposite. I think what you just were describing was how most people kind of, and most interviewers kind of viewed him. But, he's on the couch with Russell Hardy, who's trying to jab him and poke him and this or Mavis, and she's asking him about, he's on the Paxson show and he's talking about his mom and his dad. There was no love in the house, like in the most vulnerable way possible, whereas any other celebrity would have deflected the question. I never saw David. Yes, he could deflect. I mean, but when he deflected, he'd be very direct and be like, I don't want to talk about that. If it was something personal, it's that he didn't want to talk about his family or his
Yeah.
wife or something. But I actually think that David, outside of a couple years, there's very limited time in his life where he was kind of heavily intoxicated. That was one of the things I loved about him. That everyone else was trying to like figure out what and who he was. He was right there. It was just putting it out there. It was all there. There was no. It was like Kurt. There was no.
Mm-hmm.
He was so honest. I mean, that's why his art works so much. It's like, I had a guy say to me,
his
I got
music is very
to
honest.
walk and get my charger. I had a guy say to me, one of the biggest music producers. Anyways, he said, Bowie and Springsteen are like the two least authentic artists of all time. Bruce has been playing his father, who's a real working class Jersey guy. And Bowie is just can't like reveal anything about himself. And I was like, well, do you think Bertolt Brecht is dishonest? Because I think Brecht is one of the greatest artists of the 20th century and is in fact, more honest in his art because he's acknowledging the kind of machinations of the process. And I said, Bowie Bowie's kind of Brechtian. And so maybe you think that's not authentic. I think it's as fucking real as it gets.
Yeah, no, I mean, that makes sense. I was just having one of my friends speaking of like, that was also like pop art and Duchamp, that a lot of people really dislike Duchamp. One of my friends, he made a doc on Duchamp and he was telling me.
Oh, Bowie did it. Bowie loved it.
Yeah, one of my friends made a doc on Duchamp and he was telling me he was like, yeah, people don't like him, but he kind of makes you really think about what art is, especially in the context of being in a museum and seeing a urinal signed by him. And everyone's like, oh, that's not art, but it's like he exposed a lot of the process. He could say it much better than me, my friend can. But it's a similar sort of.
Well, we referenced him probably more than I heard him reference any artist. Constant, without question, he was more than Burroughs, more than anyone. I mean, Bowie. The film, the whole Moonage Daydream, is essentially an extension of that first title card. If I pulled back the part that I edited down to its full proportions, what Bowie says is it wasn't just Nietzsche; it was Joyce and Nietzsche and Duchamp and Einstein and Freud, and at the same moment in history, all of the great minds in their disciplines decided to deconstruct our belief system. And that created the anxiety of modern man, in the 20th century, or helped create a set of circumstances where we now all needed therapists. Sorry, just got bombarded with something. That was the area that Bowie was most passionate discussing. The whole chaos, fragmentation. Bowie's like a cultural anthropologist of the 20th century. I think he's I think better than James Michener. I think Bowie's the great cultural anthropologist of my lifetime. And
Yeah, no, it comes across in his work too, especially just his musical stylings, lyrics, and I'm a big fan of Nietzsche. I've read almost all of his stuff, so I was like, oh, awesome when it opened up with the quote from Nietzsche. I'm reading "Being in Time" right now by Heidegger, and that's a lot more difficult. I'm having to read all these notes with every chapter. I'm like, okay, how do I parse this? It's a lot more difficult than Nietzsche.
But see, by the way, there's another thing that I love about Bowie, which is he makes it accessible.
Yeah. He does, yeah. And that's a big thing too, because people will see like, the Gay Science or Beyond Good and Evil or something. Then they start reading it, and like reading philosophy is different than reading like a lot of other books, because certain words will actually mean different things, and you kind of have to know a little bit of the jargon and know the back kind of, maybe who Nietzsche is like referencing it in some parts, like, or whatever, right? And for just an average reader, it can seem daunting, and they're like, oh, I don't get it. But somebody like Bowie or, like an artist can take the ideas and then actually make you feel the ideas even before you kind of intellectualize them. And that's like, yeah. And that's one of the great things about art, is that like we're like irrational beings really, first and foremost. We think more with or emotions and irrationality, at least this is how I see the world, is over intellectualism. And so we end up kind of feeling ideas more than we more than we really think about them. And a lot of ideas that we have, we don't even think about them that much. And art can have these philosophical ideas, and it can strike right to your emotional core. And film and music, music especially, really just, you feel it before you may not even know the lyrics, like you can listen to, but you feel it, and you kind of get this emotional understanding of it. And good movies do the same thing.
That's why I'm prone to say Bowie can't be defined. He could be experienced, because I think that a lot of his, if you try to seek out meaning in some of his lyrics, particularly in the mid 70s when he was doing the cut-up process, he's writing with consonants and vowels. He's like and yet we can listen to those songs over and over and over and ascribe meaning to them. But this is the beauty of Bowie, that the more you listen to Sweet Thing Candidate, the more you reveal layers about yourself. You're not getting at David Jones. You're learning about yourself, and he's designing it as such. It's an invitation. Which is how Moonage Daydream was created, to be that kind of participatory experience that invites you to project, and ultimately reveal truths that are yours, not David Jones.
There's a lot of memories that I have where it's like this one particular time and place, I was in this emotional headspace because of this thing, and the song came on, and then that song then from there on out becomes associated with this like persona defining memory, and it becomes like a part of you in that sense. And there's several Bowie songs that are certainly fit that category for me, and because there's an emotional truth to them, even for some of those Bowie songs, I might not even know the lyrics, but that doesn't really matter. At least I don't think it does. But so anyway, so we're coming to the end, and I just wanted to field a couple questions. I'm just gonna check my YouTube right here and see if there's any questions from the audience that we haven't covered yet. I would love to know what surprised the filmmaker the most about David during the making of the film. I would also like to thank him and the rest of the team for making me feel closer to David as a person, not just as a musician.
Well, see, that's so interesting, because it just sort of gets at what we were just speaking
because we were just talking to stuff.
I don't know.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know if it does get us closer to David as a person. I mean, it gets us closer to who that person's idea of David Bowie is as a person, right? I mean, that's there's a truth there. The question was there anything surprising? Is that what the question was?
Yeah, like what surprised you the most about Bowie?
I think well, you have to understand that I only listened to the music before, so everything was a surprise. I had no idea he had a half brother. I had no idea that he had. I knew very little. But I would say what surprised me the most was his generosity.
Yeah, I think that came across in the film too. Um,
Well, because he's incredibly
yeah,
generous in all the interviews with the
yeah.
interviewers. I mean, he's patient and he's generous and he's present.
And I remember this story. I don't know the extent to which it's true, but I like to believe it's true, and I think it probably is. It's like when Arcade Fire made Funeral. Didn't he buy like thousands of copies and he of that and distributed it among people in the music industry?
His performance of "Wake Up" at the Grammys
Oh
is,
yeah.
which is one of his last performances. I'm gonna start crying, like trying to describe it.
Yeah. Yeah, that was a great performance.
Watching that within the context of watching everything, and I knew I was at the end. I knew
Hmm.
that it was like the last day of material that I was gonna, the second to last day or the last day. I knew we was coming to the end, and so it was down to that and I think his performance with Alicia Keys, and that was it. That was going to be it, And so I was already really emotional, and then to see him on stage with a bunch of 20-year-olds,
Yeah.
was so overtly like passing the baton. And then the way that song unfolds,
Hmm.
he kind of starts with it and then he kind of folds into the choir and
Yeah.
disappears. And oh, see, I'm getting all fucked up like thinking about it. I think the end of the film, I try to capture that, not using that footage, but that idea was certainly passing the baton, which he did in the song Black Star. And I'm definitely at the end of the film was trying to suggest that Bowie can't die because Bowie was never born.
Hmm.
Um, and you now are going to be Bowie. Each of us is now Bowie,
Yeah.
and he gave us that gift. And so, sorry,
Oh yeah, no worries.
I got a little, still have a little emotion left in me though.
So here's a question that's probably for his executor. Is will we see the 35 millimeter footage of his Earl's Court Isler 2 performance in its entirety someday? I don't know.
Well, I could answer that. Stay tuned.
Was there like another part of like his life, and they're asking about like his Black Star era or something that maybe you wish you could have gone more in depth into, but
Yeah, no,
couldn't?
not in the I wish thing.
Yeah.
But as I mentioned, I I love latter era Bowie, starting with Outside.
Yeah.
I would have loved to have gone deep into Outside and then follow his musical trajectory to Black Star, but that's not the film's not about following. The film, as you mentioned, much
Hmm.
hour or two ago, is essentially about Bowie learning how to create art from the safety of his home rather than throwing himself into the fire. And so, after he flames out in the '80s, um, he had arrived at a point where he would be able to begin the next chapter. So the movie had to
Yeah.
end where it had to end. My story had resolved itself, but the music is awesome after that, and I just didn't have an opportunity to present it.
All the other questions we tackled, I mean, we tackled a lot on this. Brad,
This is
thank you so
officially
much
the
for.
longest interview now and discussion.
I guess there's one last little question. You might not be able to say, but are you already working on your next project?
Yeah, yeah. I just got an email from my subject while we were talking that I need to
Oh,
review. But yeah, I'm start shooting and I think I'm about to find out for probably about 6 weeks.
oh, awesome.
Yeah, I'm shooting.
Cool, cool, cool.
Actually, I'm not. There will be no
Shooting.
archival footage in my next film, or hopefully in many more films to come. I'm gonna mix it up a little bit.
Shooting is always fun too. Just being on the set and kind of feeling that energy and
Not for me.
everything. That's
That's why I
always
don't do
fun.
it. I fucking hate it, but that's why I'm doing
Oh,
it,
you,
because it makes me uncomfortable. And taking my cues from Bowie, realize that I can, and
yeah.
it's better to work from that sort of space than the kind of comfort zone.
Well, Brett, I'll let you get to it. Thanks so much, and I hope you have a rest nice of the night, and all the best luck on the next project.
I hope to see you down the road. Thank you so much, and hit me up if you're in LA.